Hello, Environmental Policy 2 students. It's Dr. Conway here, back for Lesson 10 on Environmental Impact Assessment. Last week we discussed strategic environmental assessment, which applied to policy plans and programs early in the decision stage to determine whether there was any indication of unnecessary or unwanted environmental impacts of policies, plans, or programs. That differentiates itself quite a bit from the environmental impact assessment processes, which commonly focus on physical effects or physical works. And that's the emphasis of this week. And obviously, it's a major policy tool in environmental policy that garners a tremendous amount of attention by the public and by decision makers and government, of course. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act is the main act in Canada for this, and it applies to two defined categories of projects. The first one is physical undertakings related to a physical work, a dam, a new road, new construction of a marina or of a port, pipeline, things like that. And these would be activities that would have obvious risk of environmental effects, and those environmental effects would need to be reviewed. And these types of projects would almost always be covered by the EIA process, except for in cases of emergency or as part of what the Act refers to as the exclusion list of special circumstances for EIA. And so, but any sort of typical thing that we're seeing, the discussion in pipelines in Alberta, a major road construction, any major construction of a new a marina, a port in the Great Lakes, let's say, or on the West Coast, would all be covered by the EIA process. There's also a category of projects unrelated to physical works, but are specified by regulation, that if the regulation is changed or if a permit or approval is provided, there would be the need for the EIA process to take effect. And in that, these typically are things that are related to permitting, licensing, and approval activities. Even if initially there's no understanding of what the environmental effects would be, the fact that the regulation calls for an EIA being required if a license or a permit or approval activity of some other sort is allowed for, okay? And that would be what we call the first step, defining whether the EIA applies to a project or an approval. And the second step is who's responsible for complying to the EIA. That can be sometimes more difficult than it appears. But typically a federal government department or a provincial government department, if it's a cooperative federal provincial EIA process, if that department is the proponent of the project, it would need to take substantial ownership over the EIA. If it provides financial assistance, it needs to have a significant hand in managing the EIA. If federal lands or provincial lands are involved, the EIA will ride with the government. And if it issues a permits, license, or approval of some other kind. Now keep in mind that this is the oversight capacity of the department, but the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency would be the federal government's body to oversee the integrity of the EIA. The proponent department would be working with the Environmental Assessment Agency to oversee the EIA. But a private sector proponent would also have major obligations to do research, to provide evidence, supporting their position and so forth. So there are lots of parties involved, not to mention, of course, all the stakeholders that will be interested. There are two types of assessment procedures that would typically go into an EIA. If it's a major project covered by one of the above triggers, then it must undergo a comprehensive study. By that I mean if it fits into those categories I just gave you. A department has been a proponent. There's major financial assistance or public lands, or a major regulation has stipulated that if a license or approval has been provided, then it triggers a comprehensive study. But other types of studies can where we don't have as much information or legal requirements to conduct a comprehensive study, there can be what we call a screening, an EIA screening exercise to determine whether the environmental impacts will be significant or not. If they're found to be significant in the screening process, then it goes to a comprehensive study. If they're found to be minor, then the department or the proponent, in cooperation with the Environmental Assessment Agency, would be able to determine that the screening was adequate and adequate measures can be taken without having to go to a comprehensive review. How they make that decision? Well, the scale of environmental effects is one. The cumulative environmental effects that we can expect if we allow this one to go ahead and then 12 more go ahead, what are the cumulative environmental effects? That might, or if there's a relationship between this project and another project, maybe not in the same sector, that has cumulative environmental effects, then it would go to a comprehensive study. The significance of the effects. How big are they? Are they irreversible? Are they potentially short-term effects? Can they easily be mitigated or not? Public comments. Public comments play a big role in whether these things need to go to a full assessment or not. Okay? And technical and economic feasibility of mitigation measures is also a key issue. If it's going to be difficult to mitigate possible environmental effects, then a comprehensive study might point to a phased approach or a phased approach backed by other measures to enhance the technological or technical solutions. Okay? Step 4, decision-making options. Typically, a full screening report would go to a politician, to a minister, or to cabinet, if depending upon its political significance. If it's really highly politically significant, then the political authorities might designate a review panel, an environmental assessment review panel, quasi-independent or arm's-length panel of experts to determine what the scale of the risks to the environment are. If a screening process finds that that the project being proposed can be dealt with without a major comprehensive review, then that would typically be left up to the department and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency to determine that and make a decision. Okay? And of course, the final step is step 5, as we've already been through monitoring and assessment and reporting. Typically, when there's a major EIA done and the project is allowed to approve or to proceed, that is, approved and allowed to proceed, that means that there will be, as part of that approval process, there will be follow-up monitoring plans and reporting plans required. And that is a key part of anything to do with environmental impact assessment. It's not just approved and stop. If we determine that there were significant environmental effects that need to be managed, then obviously you need to monitor and report against those potential environmental effects. There's also something called class environmental assessments, where if an environmental assessment has been done, let's say on enhancing water purification facilities at the municipal level, there doesn't need to be a separate EIA done every time a municipality does the same sort of thing. Typically, these EIAs are done once as class EIAs, and then under the approvals of that EIA, other municipalities would be allowed to proceed. Those are called class environmental assessments, so that economically we're not continually doing comprehensive EIAs on the same types of projects, where we know that their similarity is such that once we devise mitigation measures for one, they're broadly applicable to a number of different projects. Okay. Now, as you see in the press and so on, public participation is a huge issue for environmental impact assessments. We're seeing this, of course, with the pipelines. I mean, that's an obvious one. But we see it with like waste disposal facilities. If they're to be set up and an EIA is required, we see the interest of the public. NIMBYism and not my backyard, so on and so forth. Public participation is very comprehensive in environmental impact assessments. And that's something you will see in my lecture notes for the week. So keep in mind that EIA is a major area of policy activity for the environment. SCA is much smaller, much more targeted on policy plans and programs, but EIA is physical infrastructure, big projects that obviously garner a lot of public attention. Keep that in mind when you're going through the notes this week, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye now.